everybody, welcome back to another episode of Spotlight on CS Ops, where we shine a light on the CS Ops practitioners and experts that make all of this machinery run. I am Matthew Lind in Austin, Texas, and my co-host, Jean Naran, up in Kelowna, British Columbia, Canada.
Hey Matthew. Hey everyone.
Great to see you. And today we have James Dahlgard with us. I am super excited to talk to him and learn from him. He is Senior Customer Success Systems Manager at Calendly, a fairly recent arrival, not brand new there, but newer, let's say. So, James, we are thrilled to have you on the show today and welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving us this forum. I've watched a few episodes. Everyone has some really cool stories, and excited to share mine as well.
Well, maybe you can get started. Maybe just tell us a little bit more about your journey then. Like how did you get to this point here at Calendly?
Yeah, so I think I've had, at least from the beginning, I have some commonalities to other folks. I'll just say, like, first off, I've always been into tech, growing up, whether it's software, hardware, video games, you name it, anything that sort of plugs into the wall, I've been into. And I've also been kind of like a builder and very analytical. Like I love taking things apart and rebuilding it in the way that I want. My wife would like joke, like every time I get like a new toy, like a motorcycle or something, before I even ride it, I'm going to take it apart and completely reshape it. So I think some of those operational traits kind of have always been there, and it just took a little while for me to find a role that kind of like helped me bring those traits out. But I went to college and studied business administration and communications and graduated with those degrees. Didn't have any focus areas in CS ops, which I've heard some other people, joke about before. So certainly had no idea what CS ops or Gainsight or anything like that related was. When I came out of college, I started in a few different marketing and sales roles, and really stayed in those roles for like the first 4 or 5, maybe even 6 years. I think my longest time at a company before moving into CS ops was at a student housing company in New York City. And I was a leasing coordinator there. So I think after a few years in that, like I didn't love being in sales. I needed to find, first like a new industry and then also a new role altogether. And I had a few friends that worked in tech and worked in SaaS, and they were CSMs, and they were explaining to me like it's less of like that hunter in the sales, and it's more of, about retention, growth, and customer satisfaction and those things. And I was like, let me give this a shot. The problem for me at that point, though, was it was 2015, so it was before like this remote world became possible, and I was living in the middle of nowhere in Connecticut at that point because I had to move back to Connecticut, and couldn't really find that type of role anywhere. So I found a company called VM Turbo, which later became IBM Turbonomic, and they were a startup at the time, and what they really needed was some operational help on their onboarding experience. So I was training and services coordinator. The role that I was kind of hired for was assigning resources to our onboarding engagements, but really what I turned it into is I noticed like we just kept like a pen and paper on tracking like how long it took customers to get to value, how long it took them to actually get those training and services engagements. Is a very technical software, kind of like Gainsight, to where you would want to have an admin. They'd go through a rigorous training cycle, become certified, and all those things. But we didn't track it anywhere. So I started work with our RevOps team. They owned Salesforce, and I built like our own object, our own fields, a bunch of reporting to basically like align and show the business what our impact on retention and growth was. And about a year into that role, the CSM manager at that company approached me, and he knew I wanted to become a CSM. And he was like, we bought this tool called Gainsight. I had no idea what it was. And he explained it to me, and he was just like, I think that you're a little bit more operational than you think. So like what I want you to do is do like a hybrid role where you'll like build this tech touch model for our smallest customers. And then you can kind of see if you want to move into that strategic CSM role or if you want to continue on sort of the ops path. Chris, if you're watching this, thank you so much. You're amazing. Because obviously like Gainsight stuck for me. Over the next 4 or 5 years, I built out our Gainsight instance there. Everything from, connecting all of our data sources, support data, telemetry data, obviously Salesforce and community, all the data sources that we had, and built out account pages, dashboards, CTA, success plans, health algorithms, all of it in Gainsight. And I like to kind of joke, like at that point, I had a lot of success over those 4 years. I also got most of my failures out of the way, obviously. So, it's pre-2020, so CX Ops was a very new thing. After that, once IBM acquired that company, I went over to two other startup scale-up size companies, built out 2 more instances of Gainsight, which is really awesome because like every time you get new data and new processes that you're building for, it's just such an incredible journey. And I think at that point, I also just became a lot more strategic minded, right? Because like the technology, like the data almost as well as anybody at the company once you've been there for a little while. So when stakeholders approach you about something that you want to build, you might find a better way just because you sort of know the system's limitations and you know exactly like what data you have and what data you don't to build something. And sort of naturally moved into a more strategic role. And that's kind of like where I've landed at Calendly. So yeah, so I've been at Calendly for about 5.5 months. I think there's 2 reasons why my journey has kind of led here. Like I've always built more of like that high touch model within CS, and Calendly is pretty unique because we have so many customers. A lot of them are just digitally led, and then you have that white glove, sort of high touch model that we're all familiar with in SaaS and everything that's in between. And then the teams here are awesome. So like within CX ops, not just CS ops, we have, I think, probably around 25 people focused in CX ops, and you can really sort of deep dive into different expertise within CX ops and work with other teams. And I've always been, part of a company where like I'm the only person that's really focused in CS ops, or maybe I'm lucky enough to have one or two other people. So to really not have to like always put on those hats, but really work with experts who really do put on that hat and wear it every single day, all day, is really cool. And the journey has sort of led there.
You like found all these people that were just like you. Maybe not just to like you, because
A
they
little
were gain side
different.
as you did, but they knew the mission as well as you did. And boom, you're like, oh, I've got friends, I've got partners, I've got colleagues in this same space. Well done.
Yeah,
Let me
that's
ask
awesome.
you. Let me ask you about something you said there, which just piqued my interest, which is like, sometimes the CS or CX ops person becomes a real expert in what you've got, where you could probably go with that data, and also quite honestly where you can't go with that data, or like some requests will come in, you're like that's past where we could comfortably go with what we've got. How long does that knowledge acquisition take when you land at a new place, and how do you tackle that knowledge acquisition? Because I would imagine a place like Calendly or any other company for that matter, there is just a lot coming at you quickly. So how do acquire your own space and your own knowledge when you're stepping into a new role?
Yeah, so I've definitely gotten this experience a couple times now. I think what I am is, and I sort of set up the expectations when I join a new organization that I'm going to be very observant. And kind of the first thing, because I usually jump into more of a Gainsight role, first thing I'll do, whether I'm building Gainsight there for the first time for that business or whether they already have an instance, I'll rebuild a C360. And the reason why I want to do that is because if I'm like a CSM and I'm looking at a C360, I want to have access to all of my data. So I need my telemetry data. I need my support data. If we have community sources, if we have like enhancement request sources in other places, I'm building all of that stuff out, building Adoption Explorer, seeing all of the trends and everything. And that really sets me up really in the first like month or two to know what data exists. And if it doesn't exist, then I'll work with our analytics teams or like our data science and engineering teams to see what transformations and things they could do upstream and send to me. And if they can't do everything, I'll start to build it within Gainsight. But really that first like 1 or 2 months, when I'm building that C360, really what I'm doing is just familiarizing myself with their strategy and with all the data that they have. And like I said, what they don't have. So, and that's really worked for me in the past, sort of few roles that I've jumped into in this capacity.
Is it a process of like, going through the rooms in the house and just like making, checking all the drawers, checking all the, I don't know, under the cupboard and whatnot? Or do you approach it like in a strategic manner? Like how do you, is that the, you just poke under all the things and make sure that you kind of can pull it up, or how do you approach that?
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, first off, like I'll meet with the other stakeholders. So in a lot of cases, like if we're bringing in support data, they'll be using something like Zendesk or something like that. So I'll meet with them and just understand what data they have, whether it's integrated. It also really depends upon whether that company already has an instance built and has some of those connections made versus when they don't. If they don't have that connection made, obviously you have to go make that connection. Then you start thinking about, okay, like if I can bring in the raw data, like if, for example, support data. I want to build some like ticket counts and show how many tickets have been opened in X number of days, or I want to like average the support experience, for like a generally in a lot of support organizations, you'll have like that thumbs up or thumbs down survey after you close a support issue. So I'll start to like really build all of those things. But it really depends like what I'm working with. I would say if I'm going into an organization that's doing it for the first time, I'm meeting with every single like technical and data platform stakeholder that we have. In Calendly specifically, like Gainsight was already here for about a year. So a lot of it was set up and it was really more about like going into the system, building the reports that I, was going to build and then going to see sort of what's missing through, yeah, I mean, like meeting stakeholders, meeting CSMs and sort of getting their idea as well. But I wouldn't say it's like super structured. It's always different. And it's very different because every company is at a very different stage of like their implementation of a solution like this.
Yeah. And I have one follow-up question. When you say build, like, are you talking about building the actual data model itself, or are you talking about like writing it down or putting it in a spreadsheet, or like what does build for audience just mean? Just so
Yeah, so I'll generally, yeah, so I work usually on like project boards, so like Asana or Jira and most of the companies I worked in. And I'll sort of create like an epic for each one of the data sources, and I'll start to track like different tasks. Like this data source is already connected. However, we're missing these data counts or we're missing all these like different data points within them. But generally like manage it through some sort of project like that. So that way I can sort of stay on top of like where I'm at within each one of those connections.
I really like that. I think it's like it's so practical and easy to achieve, right? Like you don't have to be like rocket science. Just go in, start poking around, see what it makes sense, and start documenting it. So I love that strategy. It makes so much sense.
I love that you've got a plan of attack here too. I mean, and actually springboard you into the documentation. You're
Mhm.
like, well, maybe you're selfishly, James, after the like, well, I'm gonna, document the data sources in an Epic and whatever you're doing there. But ultimately, then you set yourself up for documentation on like, oh, and this is where it all stands, whether you make it live or keep it to yourself or whatever. I think this is a very interesting strategy.
Yeah, yeah. And again, like it's generally just like the first month or two. And during that time, I'm also starting to meet with stakeholders. So, in my role today, for example, I'm meeting with, the business stakeholders, the CSM managers and leaders, and then also meeting with like our technical stakeholders, either weekly or biweekly, to kind of stay on top of each one of those things. But to really also just understand what their strategies and what their points of view, really, really are.
When you have that many folks on your, let's say, larger team, that 25 person team or so, initially, how do you find your spot in that team? Like, I imagine there are some analysts and there's some analytical minds. I imagine there's some process minds. I mean, trying to envision what all the roles might be, and then how do you sort of to stake your claim, or maybe maybe it's a little different, like market yourself as to like, and my name is James and here's what I am here to do. So how do you sort of find your place and then socialize that place to the organization that you arrive to?
I think Gainsight itself or any CSP platform, I think kind of gives you the cheat code to that because in all honesty, what a CSP is you are going to bring in all data sources, right? So like a lot of that work, whenever, Gainsight is being brought in or whether, like I'm sort of rebuilding it or building upon it, I think everyone's more excited to come to me than I am even to go to them necessarily in that case. Because again, like really what they want is they want to get that data into my system so that way we can take actions upon their data. Obviously, like we build a lot of reports and analytics that sort of get back up to the business as well. So I would say being in administrating a CSP is almost like a cheat code to that because people are more coming to you almost more than you're really sort of like branching out and going to them in a lot of cases.
I like that. And you touched on a topic there too. That's kind of like part two, right? What actions are you taking on this data? Maybe through the humans or maybe through, digital campaigns or whatever automation you might have. How do you approach that second part? Is there a structure framework that you like to use for that piece as well?
Yeah, so I mean, sort of like moving between the different segmentations of customers, I think the first thing that I do, and I'm in month 5 or 6 here at Calendly. So really what I've tried to do is after I've connected all the data and I have all the data that I need to sort of, start to strategize and make sort of actions and decisions, I try to find the commonalities because like as much as some of the, segmentations are a little different, they have different access features and things like that. A lot of the, behaviors and traits are actually going to be pretty similar to each other. So like I kind of call them like our biggest leaky buckets. Like what are the things in the life cycle that are that could be improved or are not correct right now? What are some of the risk mitigation plays that would actually help all of our customers across all segments and start to really attack those things first? And once you sort of like plug most of those larger sort of gaps that you have in your business, then you can really start to deep dive. And at Calendly specifically, we have another Gainsight admin as well. We have a few strategists that are near expert level, I would say, sort of in Gainsight as well. So at that point, we can sort of divide and conquer, but also have like our daily stand-ups and our weekly stand-ups and things like that to make sure that we're not duplicating efforts or doing anything like within one segment that won't translate to another. But playing between all of them, it's really cool because you do have that digital touch. And I think one thing that I've learned from talking to other folks within my organization is like there is a fine line between being helpful and being annoying within that digital segment, right? Like you could see yourself as being like a Netflix subscriber, for example, and you're spending hundreds to, maybe $1,000 on something per year. You don't necessarily want that like hands-on experience, someone reaching out all the time. You don't want to log into your app and see a bunch of like pop-ups and stuff like that. Like there is a fine line between being helpful and almost being annoying. And then, between all of our other sort of segmentation layers, you have some CSM pool models, you have that high touch model, and you might find like a commonality in a behavior that's sort of happening across all of them that you view as a negative, and you can sort of correlate to churn. But there's obviously like very different ways of tackling each one of those strategies. So really identifying that sort of gap in the first place, and then figuring out, okay, like how am I going to conquer this in each and every way?
So James, you talk a lot about segments and segments. We talk about that a lot in CS ops and CX ops. Without getting into all of the minutia of how your organization decides who's in which segment, but how do you even think about how a company might potentially segment? And then how do you as the operator there recommend, like, here are motions that are going to work all the way across all of the segments, because of their nature, and here maybe are some motions that no, these only work for segments 1 and 2, but not 3 through 6, or what, well, whatever they might be.
Yeah. So I think there's a few ways to always divide sort of segmentation layers. I think that there's going to be ARR, or there's going to be like the number of products. And then also, I think a lot of it is just through testing. In all honesty, like you might run some A to B sort of campaigns. So you might build some outreach campaigns. You might build some surveys and things like that to sort of understand like how the customer would want to engage with you. And then specifically, like once you sort of see that you're moving things along in the right direction, sometimes you could measure this against like a health algorithm or something like that. So you'll have an overall score, and that when you get customers into the green of that score, they renew at a certain percentage. So you can sort of see whether those plays are actually moving customers into a healthier state, which obviously causes them to either be retained and or grow. So I think it's really about just not being afraid to like actually go in and test and do something wrong in the beginning, and do some of that A to B testing and make sure that you're sort of like rolling out with the right strategy.
I love it. You're really talking about like some of the fundamental elements of customer success, like these actions, these components where they're part of the journey, right? Like you take a segment, like here's the steps this segment is going to go through, and then another segment, here's the steps that they have to go through. So you're kind of touching on a little bit of like the fine line or the balance between the, like for your role, for example, that might be a bit more technical. There's always this fine line or balance between strategy and sort of, how are we going to do it in the system? Like, what trigger and, what email and blah, 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 all those very nuts and boltsy things. In your role and in your experience, like what has that balance look like for yourself? Like, do you tend to focus a little bit on strategy and then, most of your days kind of in the weeds and the tooling, tinkering along, or where is that balance for you?
Yeah, and I think it's been like an evolution over time. So in the very beginning, obviously, when I was first getting familiar with a system like Gainsight and sort of the strategies that we wanted to run with a CSP, I think I was much more like just taking orders from people and saying, hey, like we're thinking about rolling out this strategy, and I wouldn't put up a lot of resistance to it. Nowadays, like I'll very much ask like what their motivation is. What is the outcome that you really want to drive here? And I'll ask those questions when they come to me with an idea. And in that case, like again, you as an expert on both the platform and an expert, really on your data can sort of decide like, okay, this is something that I suggest you do, and maybe we need to augment that strategy a little bit, or maybe we should do something entirely different altogether. But it's really just like that comfortability of being familiar with the technology and being familiar with your data. And once you sort of do that, at least in my experience, at that point, you can sort of like raise your hand and say, hey, I think we can do this a little bit in a better way, or like maybe we should really augment our strategy in some way.
I love that. You're becoming a strategic partner instead of just like taking orders. And I suspect, I don't want to talk on behalf of anyone, but I suspect the business and your leadership absolutely loves that aspect of what you're doing, because you're not just building, you're actually thinking about the entire ecosystem and, is that the right path, or is this the right path? And maybe posing a bunch of questions. So I love that. That's a great level up. Do you find that is a hard transition from sort of order taking or just doing the things to like getting more strategic in those conversations?
I think for me, it was very natural. And like I was saying in the very beginning of this, like I've always been somebody that takes things apart and tinkers with them and sort of puts them back together. So for me, it was a very natural transition to become more strategic. But I could see many other sort of admins that I know within the community as well that are much more technical and just deep dive into, data and the data platform, and sort of go that route. So I think for me it was very natural, but I could see, other folks that are just a lot more like into the data and into, sort of like the technical aspects of running a CSP. And at that point, you probably a little bit would be more of like an order taker as opposed to somebody that would sort of raise their hand and say, hey, let's do this a different way.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think one of our guests said something. One of our previous guests was like, "You move from administrator to advisor," and I
Right.
feel like you've made the leap, James, and then some. As we start to wind down, we've talked a lot about your past and kind of your present. Talk about the future. Give us. We'd ask this question of our guests. Give us a prediction about what you see coming.
Yeah, I think a lot of guests have talked about AI, and I'm certainly aware that that is coming as well. I think that we're disregarding the question of like, do we want AI to do things for us or do you want it to help us? I think one thing that all of us within CS ops and CX ops in general, really just operations teams in general, need to think about is becoming a data-driven culture, right? So like when you, for example, Gainsight is starting to build this new feature where an end user that might not be familiar with Report Builder can go in and query and say, hey, build me a report of these customers within this segment that have a health score below 60, for example, and it'll build them that report. You could just imagine like that's going to get better over time and it'll build charts, it'll, your donut graphs or whatever, your pie charts. And then maybe that'll end up becoming, hey, like go build this voice of the customer strategy, build this outreach campaign for me, go build this workflow or go integrate this data to this system and map it for me. And I think the most important thing for us to keep in mind is that we have to be very, very aware of the data quality. So a lot of companies I'm seeing across the board are really hiring like chief data officers or head of data and stuff like that. And I think that's really, really important. Not just because like one of my previous companies is a data catalog software, so I'm certainly I drank the Kool-Aid a little bit there, but I think it's super important, to really build sort of like that data dictionary, that data catalog. So for example, like me as a Gainsight admin, I've always sort of made myself responsible for either creating a data dictionary or if we had a catalog to use where any data that's in Gainsight and being shared upstream to, either our data lake or some sort of data warehouse, I'm responsible for like the data name, the API name, the definition of that. If I created the transformation to create that field, sort of what that calculation is. And then the sync frequency, because if other people are picking up in the data lake, like they want to know how fresh or how stale that data is at the same time. And I think it's really important for us to really focus on the data quality because if AI is going to do things with that data going forward, obviously the quality has to be of, as close to 100% accurate as possible. So that's one thing I'm just very aware of as we're setting ourselves up for like this AI future is what is the quality of data that we're putting into all of our systems and how much does everybody sort of like vocalize and talk about data? Like, are you building that data strategy in your company?
Love it.
I,
Love the
I hear
structure.
you. Oh, sorry. So I'm hearing the tinkering again in your answer, James. Like, get the data quality right. I'm hearing you taking apart the machine, the AI machine, to a degree. Who knows what's inside that thing, right? But also saying like, hey, the raw ingredients here have to be good. The parts must be right, or at least of a sufficient quality if we expect it to actually accelerate us into the future.
Yeah, it'll only perform as well as the data that feeds into it, right? So super, super important. I think that's something, again, a lot of companies are really strategizing and focusing on this. But, if you're not, I think it's time to really, sort of get focused on the data quality and building sort of like, that data steer committee within your company.
And nothing should be holding you back, right? Like now is the time to start. Like even if you're not thinking about AI right now, you might be thinking about it later and might as well start now and making sure that the data is correct and whatnot. So that's super awesome. I have one last question. Anything that you're building right now? Like are you taking anything apart on the sidelines? Is there anything that any project you're working on?
Yeah, I think one of the more fun things that I always build is a health algorithm, and a health algorithm for me serves a couple of purposes. The first one for me is always, can I point a CSM? So if this is a managed account, for example, can I point a CSM in the right direction? Can they go to this scorecard? And obviously they can go to dashboards and reports, or if you build Adoption Explorer and time series charts for them, like they can go find this data. But can I make it really obvious when a customer is, showing good behaviors or bad behaviors? Regardless where that data comes from, if it's telemetry, support related data, community related data, all of those things. And it serves that purpose. I think it also can serve the purpose for a CSM manager because a CSM manager can go in and say, hey, we have this new feature in our product. I notice in your book of business, like all of your customers are red. Do you just need some enablement on that, rolling that out to your customers? So that's sort of the first purpose. And then that second purpose is really that overall health scoring algorithm. Because if you can get it to that point of, hey, all of our customers that fall into green and fall in between like 80 to 100, for example, renew it, let's just say some random number, like a 90% clip and, grow and retain at 15%. At that point, like all your strategies that you're implementing, you can actually measure the impact for the organization. So you can say, hey, I rolled out this new life cycle or this new risk mitigation strategy 2 quarters ago, and customers within that segment have actually overall moved up more into the green. I've moved, X percentage of customers from yellow into green, for example. And you can actually measure your impact in more of like an ARR type way, which is of course what the C-level wants to, really understand and ensure like all of your strategies are not just, sort of falling. They're actually moving customers into a direction where they are going to retain and grow with you.
Amazing. I love that. Like, hey, let's take credit for our fine work here, whether that's in ops or CS. I mean, we just as a team, we'd be like, let's take credit. Because I think that's a story that often CS and CS ops isn't told well, is the impact story. So well done, James.
Yeah, I mean the play has changed so many times too. I mean, like when I first got into this, it really was just retention and growth, but it's obviously branched out to so many other things, advocacy and helping sort of feed the sales pipeline on the other end with that. So there's so many sort of different things that we're doing in CS ops. So it's awesome to be able to measure your performance and your impact.
By all means, by all means. Well, on that note, it has been a pleasure. James, it's so great to talk to you and hear about your journey and hear about your tinkering, which really understates, I know, the fine work that you do when we call it tinkering, but just really being able to say, I know what's in there, and sharing it with our audience. So it's been a pleasure, James. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks again for having me.